Europe. Africans and Europeans living side by side. In fact, a lot of European families have an African background that they don't like to acknowledge.
Queen Charlotte, she was a woman of African descent, and this is well known throughout Europe. There was another guy, King Charles. Many people say that he has an African origin as well, that he has African ancestry. King Charles was referred to as the black boy growing up because he was so dark. And they have pubs over in Europe now called the Black Boy Pub or the Black Boy Inn, which refers to...
Born in 1661, King Charles II of Spain was the result of 200 years of inbreeding that intended to strengthen the family line. He was breastfed until the age of 4 and never fully learned how to walk. Before reaching the age of 6, Charles miraculously survived a series of diseases, including chickenpox, measles, rubella, and smallpox. As an adult, he was completely illiterate and could barely chew or speak due to his deformed jaw and enlarged tongue. He was so ugly and disfigured that his own wife was terrified of him. Famous historians Will and Ariel Durant vividly described him as short, lame, epileptic, senile, and completely bald before 35.
There's also knowledge about King Charles being a descendant of the de' Medici family. The de' Medici family out of Europe, out of Italy, they're known to have that African bloodline as well. One of the de' Medicis, Alessandro de' Medici, who was a ruler in Italy, you look at pictures of him, this dude looks like Ryan Leslie. So you could see that African bloodline running through a lot of these people of royal descent.
Thinking that Pope Alexander was uniting the Italian states against. Similarly, Soderini was exiled as Pope to Emperor. Second, the Florentine Charles V. At this point, the senior to that, Joanna's mother was Anna of Bohemia and Hungary. 4. A series of wars and just overall bad policies mixed with it was merely a pawn in the rivalry between France and Spain and of rule of the Medici. Let me talk about one other figure on this chart, Pope Leo XI.
There were blacks in Scotland. There was one black Scottish king named Kenneth the Dub. There are figurines of and carvings of black Scots.
The Celtic Druids was the African priesthood that had gone into Europe and had inhabited the islands of what we today call Ireland, inhabited what we today call so-called Great Britain, Scotland, and Wales. It inhabited Holland, inhabited Denmark, was all up in there.
Many Greeks and Romans were biracial, to use a modern term, which they didn't use back then. They were biracial. Their look, okay, could not readily on the surface be absolutely identified as European or black because many of them was of a biracial stock.
Hannibal Barca, the great military genius, he comes from an African background. In a lot of movies and on television shows.
Princesses to marry the black kings of Scotland in order to make them less black by diluting the blackness as the children were born. Mary, Queen of Scots, was accordingly half black, but her husband Darnley was completely black. This meant, of course, that James I, their son, was also entirely black, and Charles I and his son Charles II were both mixed race. Pictures showing the true colours of these monarchs have been destroyed and replaced with forgeries showing them as white. This is part of the white supremacist agenda. As I say, these nutty ideas have escaped from the black Hebrews and are now being adopted by a lot of ordinary black people, which goes some way to explain things like the Black Queen Charlotte in the Netflix series Bridgerton, with some.
Now on to the main question. What did Charlotte really look like? And why do people think she might have been Britain's first biracial queen? This idea has recently been repopularized because of the new Bridgerton spin-off. Because it casts Charlotte as a black woman, including the disclaimer that the show is simply fiction inspired by fact. So let's dive into all the evidence, both for and against the theory that Charlotte was biracial. The idea began in the early 1900s by those who were simply observing her portraits. German historian Bernhard Springer concluded that between her portraits, specifically those by Alan Ramsey, and the numerous descriptions of her broad nose and lips that she must have some African ancestry. Then, J.A. Rogers expanded on this idea in his 1940 book called Sex and Race. But there was no real research conducted here. These were just early observations and assumptions made by scholars. It was only in the 1990s that her ancestry was actually looked into by a genealogist and Black history researcher named Mario de Valdez y Cocum, who presented his findings in a PBS Frontline episode about Queen Charlotte. Cocum worked from a few sources. First, he noticed that some things had been said about Charlotte by those closest to her, which supported this theory. Her physician allegedly said that she had a mulatto face, which is an outdated and offensive way to describe someone of mixed African and European ancestry. Sir Walter Scott wrote that she was ill-colored, which I take to mean anything that was outside of the norm of European whiteness at this time. Cocum also found that Queen Charlotte was, and I quote, directly descended from a Black branch of the Portuguese royal house, particularly a Moorish mistress of Alfonso III named Madrigana, who lived in the 13th century. This leads us to an interesting question. Could Queen Charlotte's appearance have been influenced by a relative from 500 years back?
Might have watched. Because left-wing whites are often ashamed of the colour of their skin, they go along with this madness and even encourage it by producing museum exhibits of the kind about which I talked yesterday. This is all going to get a lot worse yet, because lunacy like this is spreading like a virus.
Makes it very clear. Enslaved people were very prominent in this. Once again, as you can see, listed under commodities, so they were not seen as people, but as a good.
Owning slaves was never legal under British law, but in a cynical, deliberate loophole for 150 years, trading in slaves was. It says so explicitly in the careful calligraphy of the Charter of the Royal African Company. It was granted by the last king named Charles II in 1663.
I mean, these goals were the goals of the royal family. Not only investing in, they were heavily engaged with how this company was practicing their business.
King William III received shares in the Royal African Company. His successor, George